Well, today we meet our friends, my family, the Pilgrims. I'm very excited to introduce them to you as real people because before they were monuments, before they were salt and pepper shakers, they were people first. So let's go back 12 generations or so to remember what our revered ancestors were like. If, like me, you know you're descended from a pilgrim, congratulations. But if you have ancestors in New England before 1700, you're likely related to at least one of the Mayflower Pilgrims. These are all 102 pilgrims who left for the New World on the Mayflower in 1620. These two got married. So they are a twofer, two pilgrim ancestor families for the price of one. Meet John Alden and Priscilla Mullins, which you may know about because of the famous poem. Or you may be a descendant, and it's a good bet you are. They take up 5 silver books. Do you have grandchildren like me? Maybe, yes. You can nod your head. Do you have great-grandchildren? I don't have great-grandchildren yet. Do you have more than 100 great-grandchildren? John and Priscilla had 400, nearly 400 great-grandchildren, and all their descendants are related to 2 pilgrim families. But that story doesn't happen for a while, so let's start at the beginning. We will follow this timeline, and we start at the beginning, 1580 to 1606. Now, keep in mind that in 1607, the Jamestown colony will begin, so there's a lot of news about people starting over somewhere else. Meet the first of the Pilgrims and the power couple, William and Mary Brewster. Respected, educated, and generous, they love their flock of believers. They spend their entire fortune protecting them, starting in England. They're very spiritual, and William is known for his singular good gift of prayer, which we will discover is very important. William has been educated at Cambridge, where he saw the divinity students acting like frat boys, fraternity brothers, and he fears for his church as a result. This begins his spiritual search for the truth. At their home, Scrooby Manor, William and Mary invite dissident ministers like Richard Clifton, the grave and fatherly old man with the great white beard, and John Robinson, the Bible scholar with the burning desire shut up in his bones to separate from the church. People come from miles around to listen, like 12-year-old orphan William Bradford, future governor of the Pilgrims, whom Mary and William take in to raise and protect. Born just 30 miles from the Brewsters, young William loses his father when he's 1, his mother when he's 7, then his grandparents by the time he turns 12. Though he's been a sickly child, William takes strength in reading his Bible, maybe just from lifting it. Do you notice the text that's in the margins of his Bible? What do you suppose that is? Study notes? Yes, today we would call this a study Bible. They called it the Geneva Bible. This is heresy to anyone in the established church. This allows anyone who can read to understand God's word without that pesky middleman, the priest, who only prays by reading from the Book of Common Prayer. In fact, the Bible tells them that anyone can create and lead prayer. Do you see why William Brewster's gift of prayer is so important? It's not an easy thing to do. Nobody's known how to do it before. These are turbulent times. Those who are caught in these illegal meetings are arrested and even executed. You can see the history of their religious persecution based on what the Brewsters named their children. First, Jonathan, no persecution. He mentors young William Bradford and becomes a church leader in his own right. Then daughters, Patience and Fear, just before they flee to Holland. Then love, and then finally wrestling. Bradford calls them wrestle. Should we stay or should we go to the New World? That's what they're wrestling with. Here's a tip. They decide to go. Now is the time for their first exodus to the Netherlands, which we call Holland. Dissenters are escaping to Holland, which has freedom of religion. What a concept. However, this is not religious utopia. While 21 people follow Clifton and Robinson there, other separatist groups have already moved there, trying to develop their own religion. For example, 2 brothers in one congregation, the Ancient Brethren, get into a huge feud. One is a pastor, the other a parishioner. The pastor marries a rich widow who likes pretty clothes, lots of lace and silk and fancy jewels, which most of their parishioners cannot afford. And she wears a stiff ruff, like royalty and their oppressors. The new pilgrims call this starch that makes these ruffs the devil's soup. They never wore stiff ruffs. So if you see a painting of the pilgrims with a stiff ruff, the artist had no clue who the pilgrims really were. Another issue is about a lay leader who's taking advantage of the lonely widows. As a result, they create two unwavering rules for the new pilgrim religion. No fancy clothes, and widows must marry soon after their husband's death. Plus, they decide to leave Amsterdam and move south to the university town of Leiden with their congregation, which has grown to 100. During their decade in Leiden, with John Robinson's passionate preaching, their congregation grows to 300. Even after 1620, John Robinson stays to continue to lead their flock. They don't meet at St. Peter's Kirk, but at the nearby house on Stink Alley. In his History of Plymouth Plantation, which is in our genealogy library, William Bradford calls Leiden that goodly place. But is it really? To work in the dominant textiles industry there, you have to become a free man, which means you have to renounce England. You are watched and judged by your peers, and you have to join a guild. To join a guild, you have to become a citizen of the Netherlands, and then of the town, and you have to be voted on by the other members. Then you have to pay dues to get paid. Otherwise, you starve. Some chose to starve. What work can they do? They don't speak the language yet, and generally their only work experience is tending farm animals. Because William Brewster was educated at Cambridge, he is able to teach English at the university. But his fame and infamy comes with writing and typesetting, along with Thomas Brewer and Edward Winslow, who was just 14 at this time. They publish a booklet called Perth Assembly, which makes Professor Brewster a wanted man by the spies of the Church of England. So in 1618, he goes underground back in England where he has contacts. Thomas Brewer is caught and eventually spends 14 years in an English prison. Young William Bradford learns the trade of fustian weaver, fussy fustian. Not religious, but it pays well enough to afford to get married. He marries young Dorothy May, and they have a son, Jonathan, likely named after William and Mary Brewster's son, who influenced the young Bradford. New people are joining the Pilgrim congregation regularly, and many are related. Dorothy is the niece of fellow Pilgrim William White. Meet William and Susanna White. His mother is the grandmother of Dorothy Bradford. He works as a wool comber. By the time they get on the Mayflower, they have 2-year-old Resolved, my ancestor, and the unborn Peregrine, who waits until they arrive in Cape Cod to arrive. Susanna isn't the only pregnant pilgrim. Meet Isaac Allerton and his wife Mary, who is also great with child on the Mayflower. Isaac has been an apprentice blacksmith in England, but quits his contract. Not good. To move to Leiden. Here he learns the job of a tailor, but has great hopes for building an empire in the New World. After all, they will bring 3 children, daughter, remember, Bartholomew, and little Mary, my ancestor. Isaac and Big Mary have a double wedding with his sister, Sarah, who married Degory Priest. Sarah and Degory have 2 daughters, Mary and Sarah, in Leiden. He is a hatter in business with Godbert Godbertson. What a name. We'll hear that name again later. Degory is a bit of a tattletale. He brings people to court for adultery based on what he hears at the tavern. So the locals are not happy with him. There are a lot of court records about him. And meet Thomas Rogers, married to Alice. He is a successful camlet merchant. Have you heard of camlet before? It's a luxury fabric of camel fur and silk. They have 4 children. He will sell their home before he and oldest son, Joseph, leave on the Mayflower, and then plans to have his wife and younger children join them on the next ship. The best laid plans of mice and men often go awry. After living in Holland for 10 or more years, their children are friends with the freewheeling Dutch. They are happily experiencing all the freedoms that allowed the separatists to move there. The Pilgrims are horrified at what their children are becoming. They're becoming Dutch. So they start thinking about moving. The first Pilgrims we just met are part of the faction known as the Saints, who come to the New World. Yes, to seek religious freedom, but they have that in Holland. They want to be English with their own congregational religion and be able to provide for their families. Now it's time for their second and most famous exodus. 1620, the historic year, 400 years ago. Catholic Spain is threatening to invade Holland again. They are in the middle of the 80 Years' War. The Pilgrims decide to get a ship or two and head to the New World. Will it be the Caribbean? They considered it to save money on clothes. Can you imagine the Pilgrims in a bikini? Canada? Too cold. Jamestown in Virginia? Too close to the Church of England members. But Northern Virginia, along the Hudson River, what do we call that today? New York. It wasn't even New Amsterdam yet. It was simply a wilderness where there are no friends to welcome them, nor inns to entertain or refresh their weather-beaten bodies, no houses or much less towns to repair to, the ends of the earth. But they are poor and they need help paying for the voyage. So they send two of their flock, Robert Cushman and John Carver, the offices of Cushman and Carver, back to England to find the money men. Meet the London merchant adventurers. The adventurers front the money for the expenses of the planters who will plant the new colony. The adventurers are the gamblers. Today we would call them venture capitalists. They expect the planters to pay back with interest their $2 million investment in today's money. Woohoo! Anyone interested in opportunity? Buy a one-way ticket with cash or 7 years hard labor and get 200 acres of land. Why would anyone consider doing this? In England, all land belongs to the king, or his counts, dukes, earls, so there's no way you can own land. Lease, yes, if you were great friends with royalty, but not own. One of the Pilgrims, Francis Billington, inherits a land lease while he's in the New World. Do you think he goes back for it once he becomes a landowner? The answer is a resounding no. At work, we would say that's a hard no. All family property, like your home, by law, is left to the firstborn son. So no one gets anything else. Everyone else heads to the big city. The big city of London in the 1600s is a stinky, plague-ridden crime fest. Would you want to raise your sons there? What about your daughters? So when some merchants hear about the opportunity to go to the New World, where everyone can own land, sign me up. What skills do they have? Let's meet some Pilgrims from London. Meet William Mullins, a shoe and boot maker. He brings his wife Alice, teens Joseph and Priscilla, remember, who will have 400 great-grandchildren. The Mullins also have a grown son and daughter who stay behind in England. William is a planner and a hard worker. He has cobbled 250 pairs of shoes and 13 pairs of boots that they bring on the Mayflower. Meet bachelor Peter Brown, friend and possible relative to Alice Mullins. He is most famous for his Mastiff. As a weaver, he needs sheep, and Mastiffs can be a very protective sheepdog. Imagine that dog on the Mayflower. He quickly makes friends with another bachelor, John Goodman, the other dog lover who brings a Springer Spaniel on the Mayflower. Good hunting dog. It can flush out the game and retrieve it. In Plymouth, Peter marries, so he has descendants. John Goodman is not so lucky. Meet Stephen Hopkins, the Mayflower hunk. Stephen is educated and well-traveled. He currently is a successful tanner, which means he's able to bring his wife Elizabeth who's the third pregnant pilgrim, their little daughter Damaris, along with teens Giles and Constance from his first marriage. Plus, as indentured servants, they have the two Edwards, Dodie and Leicester. What is an indentured servant? Stephen pays for their passage. Then they work for the family 7 years to pay it back. Stephen knows that the more help, the better. He is the only pilgrim to have been in the New World already. He was on the ill-fated Sea Venture, headed to Jamestown, when the ship met a hurricane on the coast of uninhabited Bermuda. All 150 passengers survived, long enough to build 2 ships to take them all to Jamestown, giving Will Shakespeare the idea for a story. It's a good story, too. Stephen Hopkins told his own story. It seems that the castaways were fighting about who was in charge. Hopkins reasoned that the shipmaster had no say over them as they weren't on the sea, and the Virginia governor appointed by the king, who happened to be on the ship, had no say over them as they weren't in Virginia. Hopkins argued that as a result, they had the right to stay in lush Bermuda if they wanted to. This mutiny led to his death sentence. Fortunately, his silver tongue got him out of it. Stephen is excited to come back to the New World with critical experience on how to survive and how to get along with the Indians. He knew Pocahontas. Speaking of silver tongues, meet the Billingtons. They were the first ones I discovered as family, and that's who helped me become a member of the Mayflower Society. Merchant John Billington sees opportunity in the New World with his wife Eleanor and teen sons John Jr. and Francis, my ancestor. As a salesman, John Sr. is a fun and friendly man who has an independent streak, which was passed along in our DNA. Unfortunately, independence is not a welcome trait in 1620. These next pilgrims are hired by the merchant adventurers to help grow the plantation. Meet Francis Eaton, a house carpenter. He brings his wife Sarah and baby Samuel. And finally, John Alden. Remember, 400 great-grandchildren? He is hired to be the ship cooper to make the barrels and protect its contents. He gets the job because his cousin is Christopher Jones, master mariner of the Mayflower. Not only did he protect their precious cargo of food and drink, he saved the Mayflower itself. Because they were traveling in the fall, weather was a real concern. During one of the nor'easters they endured, the ship's main beam cracked. Mayflower was certain to sink, but Alden figured out the solution. They had brought on board a giant screw for building houses. Use that to prop up the beam. That kept Mayflower afloat until she returned to England. The Pilgrims were so impressed with this young man, they begged him to stay with them, and he did. On the opposite end of the spectrum is the first governor of the Pilgrims, Christopher Martin, both planter and merchant adventurer. He didn't just buy a ticket, he invested in the whole venture. As a result, he got himself appointed governor of the travelers and purchasing agent for all their communal provisions. He was hated equally by all. He offended both the Pilgrims and the sailors by his ignorant boldness in meddling and controlling things he didn't know about, that some sailors threatened to mischief him. Good grief! What a voyage! Still want a ticket? The second faction of planters, or pilgrims, as we call them, are collectively known as the strangers, because the saints don't know them at all. Yet. George Willison tells us about them in his book, Saints and Strangers, which we have in the genealogy library. Meet your pilgrims who board the Mayflower. 50 men, 19 women, 14 teens, although they don't call them teens, they are just children who serve their parents, and 19 younger children who are taken care of by their parents still. 102 pilgrims start on the voyage. The saints leave on July 22nd. But where do they leave from? Here's a hint. Somewhere on this map. Of course, it's the Netherlands. Delfthaven, in fact, but not on the Mayflower. They buy their own ship, the Speedwell, so they can have one to keep when they get to the New World. The strangers board the Mayflower in London's Legal Quays, a dangerous area where even the government officials are on the take. Both ships meet up in Southampton to get William Brewster, who's been in hiding. Remember, he's been in the underground. His cargo includes lots of books because he knows they have much to learn and none to teach them. They try to leave England twice, but the Speedwell is not seaworthy. Those who are still determined abandon her and combine into the Mayflower. No social distancing then. Finally, they leave Plymouth on September 6, 1620. 5 weeks after the Saints first get on a ship. 5 weeks of food being eaten. 5 weeks of seasickness. 5 weeks of fear of capture. Stress? And this was not a stress-relieving pleasure cruise. They were trapped between the decks of a cargo ship. No portholes, which means no air, no light, no privacy, just a small space for their meager belongings and straw bed, and the slop bucket for anything that comes out of your body. Plus William Brewster's live cargo, goats, pigs, and chickens, plus the dogs in the ship's mouser, none of which use a slop bucket. Imagine an outhouse in August. That smell every day for months. That's what it was like. Have you ever been in a cold, dark theater where it's so cold you take a blanket and as soon as the movie's over, you rush outside to warm up? The Mayflower was that cold, dark theater where no movie plays, with that outhouse smell, where all the seats are wet and you cannot get warm. Then, with every storm, it turns into a roller coaster with no seatbelt and nothing to hold down the full slop buckets, with crying babies, barking dogs, and squealing piglets. Welcome to the Mayflower ride. Want a ticket? And in that dark, dank, stinky nightmare roller coaster, 3 women give birth. Sadly, in 1620, 1 in 3 women what? Died from childbirth. On the Mayflower, it was Mary Allerton and her baby boy. But childbirth is also hope, and baby Oceanus, Hopkins, is born in the middle of the ocean, and Peregrine White is born in the middle of Cape Cod, the first recorded birth in New England. The passengers are getting weary. You think? They've been aboard ship 37 days before they even leave the English Channel, then 66 days crossing the Atlantic. Young teenager Francis Billington, my ancestor, son of independent thinker John Billington, was so bored with nothing to do, he decided to have a little target practice with the family hunting gun inside a wooden ship near the powder kegs. Could have blown up the whole ship, but it didn't. As a result, he gained a reputation with William Bradford and a few of the other men. Finally, they see land. But it's not Virginia. It's the dark, lonely wilderness of Massachusetts, and they are afraid to get off the ship because they don't have the king's permission to be there. Everyone is on edge. The men begin to fight about whether to go on to VA or stay in MA. They try to head south, but the shoals are too dangerous for Mayflower to navigate. But if they stay in Massachusetts, they have no legal authority to be there. Some say that's okay. They don't need anyone's approval. Sound familiar, Stephen Hopkins? They finally agree to stay and want it committed to writing. They call this their agreement between the settlers of New Plymouth. We call it the Mayflower Compact, one of the foundational documents of American liberty. This is why they are able to elect their own governors. Emotions subside as they plan their next steps. Their goal is to plant a new colony, and they know that Jamestown is struggling with few women and children. Not only do the Pilgrims have their own children, but they also have young servants like William Button and Edward Thompson, the first Pilgrims to die while still aboard the Mayflower. But they also have wards in their keeping, like the Moore children. These children are traveling without either parent. Can you imagine why, when both their parents are living? When their father found out he wasn't their father, he promptly divorced their mother, took custody of her children, and placed them on the Mayflower to their expected doom. Jasper was the first sibling to die. That was also a tragic day for Dorothy Bradford. William Bradford's young wife is despondent about their own 4-year-old son, Jonathan. Back in England, when Mayflower was ready to leave port forever, at the dock, William Bradford decides to leave their child behind. Instead, he gives her Jasper Moore to help take care of. The last sound Dorothy hears as they leave port is little Johnny's mournful wailing for his mother. Imagine her heartbreak, remembering that painful goodbye. Then little Jasper dies. On an icy but calm December day, safely in Plymouth Harbor, just after Jasper Moore dies, Dorothy slips overboard and drowns. Bradford, who is out exploring with the men, barely mentions it in his diary. His son Jonathan eventually comes to the New World, but never has a relationship with his father. 18-year-old Joseph Rogers survives, but Dad Thomas dies that winter. His wife and children left behind in Leiden are now left without a home and without means. They even live in the poorhouse before finally making their way to Plymouth. Governor Christopher Martin, his wife Mary, and stepson all die that winter. No mischief required, just a pandemic. These are the Pilgrims who got on the Mayflower. These are the ones who survived the general sickness that winter. Only 4 families are left intact. The healthy ones work diligently to tend to the sick ones. At the risk of their own health, they fetch wood, make fires, prepare food, and feed it to the sick. Unlike the sailors who faced the same conditions, William Bradford writes that the Mayflower Pilgrims did it willingly and cheerfully, without the least grudging, showing their love to their friends and brethren. After enduring hothead Christopher Martin as governor, the men elect the sweet-natured people-pleaser John Carver, who has worked with Robert Cushman to obtain funding for the Pilgrims. Remember Cushman and Carver? His wife Catherine was the midwife to help with the births and sister to the wife of their beloved pastor John Robinson. When the hard winter soil was finally soft enough to till, John worked harder than anyone to ensure their crops would be successful. Sadly, as a result, he died from a heat stroke. Can you imagine heat stroke after enduring that winter? Catherine followed him a few weeks later. Some say she died of a broken heart. The winter was spent trying to survive and build houses, followed by spring planting, and finally the fall harvest. Do you see why that first Thanksgiving was so important to them? They weren't just celebrating the harvest, they were celebrating survival. However, through the second winter, the provisions they brought on the Mayflower are dwindling fast. With only a few bushels of corn, beans, and squash from their communal farm, and the wild game and fish they are lucky enough to catch, they're hanging on, barely, desperate for ships. When the ships arrive, what do they bring? Nothing. The Fortune, with 30 young, lusty men and not so much as a pot between them. Charity and Swan, with 60 men and no provisions. What were the Pilgrims instructed to do? Feed them. This was their year of starvation. Finally, the Anne and the Little James arrived with 90 passengers, many wives and children of the Mayflower Pilgrims, and provisions. There is great rejoicing. And each family who was promised 200 acres of land is given 1 acre per adult and a ½ acre for each child, which they are happy with. The congregation is now turning into a community. By 1624, Captain John Smith visits. He was the first to explore the area and name it New Plymouth, or rather let Bonnie Prince Charles name it. He was a good king's man. And now gives us details about how they are doing. There are 32 dwelling houses, a fort well built with room for church services below, a fair watchtower, that means nice, pretty, not fair to middling, some cattle and goats, many swine and poultry. He says there are about 180 persons living in families or households, which averages to about 5.5 people per house. Every man follows his trade or profession, both by land or by sea. All the heads of the families are partners in the farmland, and all care for the community farm stock. They have young men as apprentices and servants, plus specialty trades such as ship carpenters, salt makers, fish masters, all with great wages. It's a real community with a real network of friends. The plantation of a new world is now yielding fruit. This is the last stage of the Pilgrim timeline and the start of their descendancy toward creating us. They want to marry and have families, but who do they have to choose from? Those left behind. That's why we have two for ancestors. Now it's 1627 and time for the great cattle division. Like the division of land, they parcel out each goat and cow. We are not going to talk about the goats and cows. But this important census lists Mayflower Pilgrims, which they still call the planters. They still call themselves planters. And those from the Fortune, Anne, and Little James, which they call the Old Comers. They're listed in groups of 13 of their choice based on whose company they keep. We'll take a peek at some of these companies, and some we'll look at in more detail. Here's a new pilgrim to meet, Francis Cooke, woolcomber. You can tell he was on the Mayflower because he's in blue, like his son John. Francis is not my ancestor, but one of my cousins. Real close. His wife Hester and the rest came on the Anne and the Little James. Based on Hester's name, where do you think she's from? Le Mehu. Esther Le Mehu. She's a French Walloon. That's a French Protestant who escaped to Belgium. As is her nephew, Philippe Delanois, who becomes Delano. Sound familiar? Remember Isaac Allerton, the tailor with 3 children? After losing Mary in childbirth, he marries William Brewster's daughter, Fear, which gives him a lot of standing in the community. He is realizing his dream of creating an empire. In the 1633 tax census, he is the richest man in town. After Fear dies, he pioneers transatlantic and coastal trade. He becomes known as the father of New England commerce. But he is also banished from Massachusetts. The whole state, my son said. Yeah, that's a whole presentation of its own. Let me give you the Cliff Notes version. The adventurers who paid for the Pilgrims' moving costs expected the Pilgrims to pay off that debt the year half of them died. That's why the supply ships came with no supplies. So the Pilgrims worked hard to collect raw materials that had value. They sent the Fortune back with a cargo full of beaver pelts, hewn lumber, and sassafras that would have paid off 1/3 of their $2 million debt. But it was hijacked by pirates in sight of the English Channel. The thieves took all their goods except Mort's Relation, a journal of what the Pilgrims found in the New World. So the Pilgrims desperately renegotiate to pay a discounted amount by 1627. They're full of industry to make money to pay the debt. And Isaac Allerton is in charge of the cash. Do you see a problem here? Somehow the communal debt goes further in the hole while Isaac alone gets rich. As a result, he is banished from the entire state as a thief. By the way, do the Pilgrims ever pay the debt? Unlike Jamestown, they do, from their booming trade with the Indians in Maine. Why not Massachusetts? That's a Miles Standish story we don't have time for. Bartholomew is so embarrassed by his father that he returns to England in disgrace. Remember, marries and moves to Marblehead, you have to say it like that, Marblehead, Massachusetts, where her father follows and remarries before moving to Connecticut for good. Little Mary, my ancestor, becomes Mrs. Thomas Cushman, son of the Pilgrims' chief negotiator. They have 55 grandchildren, and she lives to 1699. Isaac Jr., as grandson of William Brewster, is raised by William Bradford. He graduates from Harvard in the class of 50 and becomes colony governor for a time, something his grandfather never wanted to do. He did not want to be a leader, except a spiritual leader. Remember Isaac's sister Sarah, who married hatmaker Degery Priest? While still in Leiden, she hears that Degery has died. So she marries his partner, Godbert Godbertson, also known as Cuthbert Cuthbertson, who is from Poland. That's why he might make Polish hats like this. There are a lot of people like John Crackstone Jr. He came with his father, who died the first winter, but poor Jr. will soon get lost and die in the frozen woods without ever marrying. But not Captain Miles Standish, nicknamed Captain Shrimp by his enemies because he was red-faced, short, and short-tempered. Neither saint nor stranger, Captain Shrimp was hired in England to build a militia to protect the colony. Remember the Longfellow poem we saw earlier? The story is a myth that goes something like this. After his wife Rose dies, Miles wants young Priscilla Mullins for himself, but is too shy to court her. So he asks his friend John Alden to do it. When John asks her to marry Miles, she says, "Speak for yourself, John Alden." We used to say that a lot in my family. So Miles marries Barbara, who came in on the Anne, and their son Alexander gives us a Pilgrim threefer. He marries John and Priscilla's daughter, Sarah. If you are descending from their children, you are descended from Alden, Mullins, and Standish. But if you notice their daughters' married names, you might recognize even more Pilgrims. That makes their kids fourfers. Remember Susanna White, who gives birth to Peregrine on the Mayflower? She and both boys survived the winter, but husband William does not. So she was in a New World first. What do you think she was the first European woman to do? Here's a hint, she's not Pocahontas. Get married to writer and future ambassador Edward Winslow. Pocahontas was the first woman to marry an Englishman. Remember John Rolfe? That's a whole other story. Resolve marries the daughter of a money man for Jamestown. So if, like me, you were descended from them, you are eligible for membership in 2 lineage societies. Peregrine and his wife Sarah are publicly punished for having relations before marriage. Not because they were caught in the act. Dozens of married couples are humiliated like this until the Pilgrims realize that some babies could come as early as 7 months. They go on to have 8 children. And he lives to 1704, the longest lived person on the Mayflower. A little rough and rowdy as a sea captain, but his obituary says he came back to his faith in the end. John Howland was the miracle pilgrim. John should have died while still on the Mayflower. He fell overboard during a storm, but grabbed a halyard that touched his hand. He couldn't see anything, and the crew was able to rescue him. It's a good thing, too. Later, when witch hysteria was sweeping their neighbors in Boston and Salem, John was magistrate that year. The wife of Miles Standish's lieutenant was accused of being a witch who took the shape of a bear. Howland fined the accuser 5 pounds and a whipping for bringing nonsense to court. Good for him. That was the only witch trial in Plymouth. Howland, who had worked for Governor Carver, marries Elizabeth Tilley, daughter of John and Joan Hurst Tilley. They named their first child after Desire Minter, who was also with the Carvers as a ward. We'll hear more about her later. There's our sweetheart couple, John Alden and Priscilla Mullins. I just recently discovered I'm descended from them too. That makes numbers 8 and 9 Pilgrim ancestors for me, if you're counting. I collect Pilgrim ancestors. They have 10 children. And how many great-grandchildren? Their first daughter, Elizabeth, was the first English girl born in New England. She lives to see her 93rd birthday, and while living, her granddaughter, Bradford, isn't that a cool name for a girl? Bradford becomes a grandmother. How many of you have a grandchild who is now a grandparent? Pretty impressive lifespan. Remember that Stephen Hopkins brought 2 indentured servants, Edward Doty and Edward Leicester, the 2 Edwards? But they didn't get along. In fact, before that first Thanksgiving, Their animosity culminated in a duel, the first in New England. They both drew blood. Nobody died. As soon as his debt is paid off, Leicester leaves for Jamestown. Doty stays, marries Faith Clark, has 9 children, one of whom is my ancestor. He is listed as the 2nd richest man in Plymouth, after Isaac Allerton. Opportunity only available for a former servant in the New World. Our original Pilgrim, William Brewster's family, where's Mary? She's gone. Of the 8 Mayflower Pilgrims that sail at age 50 or greater, only William and Mary survived the first winter. John Rigsdale, the oldest to get on the Mayflower, at 70. Can you imagine getting on the Mayflower at age 70? He's gained fame recently as a character in a video game, as the Pilgrim zombie. So what happens to William? 20 years after Mary dies, William Brewster, the first and most loved of the saints, dies in his bed in peace amongst the midst of his friends who mourned and wept over him. He spends his final years reading his 400 books, more than the endowment used to start Harvard. His books included Machiavelli, The Prince, a book about turtles, and a vulgar play about a Roman empress. I wonder if William Bradford approved. Probably not. Remember the Moore children from the famous custody battle? Richard alone foils his father's devious plan and grows up to become a ship's captain working for Isaac Allerton and survive to a lusty 83 with lots of descendants. Henry Sampson is the cousin of Humility Cooper, who's only 1 when she arrives on the Mayflower. And she is one of the 3 who return to England. Humility is an orphan before she even gets on the Mayflower. Her aunt and uncle die that first winter, so the church elders raise her until she is 8. Then they send her back to England. To who? To what? Where she dies before she's 20. Desire Minter, the ward to Governor and Mrs. Carver and friend to John Howland, returns to England as soon as John marries Elizabeth Tilley instead. But they name their first daughter Desire. Little consolation on a long winter's night. And Bartholomew Allerton, who returns to England in his father's disgrace. Edward Winslow also returns to England on several occasions to get his portrait done. In fact, this is the only portrait done of an actual pilgrim during their lifetime. So it's kind of cool to have. But while he serves as an ambassador to England for the Plymouth colony, he stays a Plymouth resident. Unfortunately, he dies in the Caribbean while on colony business. It was a deadly place to live. His brother John comes to Plymouth and marries Mayflower orphan Mary Chilton. But their younger brother Gilbert, who came on the Mayflower, can't find a wife. So he finally decides to return to England for good. Did anybody think about introducing him to Desire? And one of Isaac Allerton's servants, William Lathan, grows up but has lots of troubles with a publicly unfaithful wife and a neighbor's wife who burns down his house. He says hasta bye-bye to Plymouth and returns to England for good. Later, he brings a tour group to the Bahamas, where they all starve to death. In all, 5 pilgrims return to England for good. Where's little Oceanus, who was born on the Mayflower? He doesn't make it through one of the epidemics that ravaged the colony. But Giles and Constance do, plus the Hopkins increased their family by 5 in the New World. Notice John and Eleanor Billington and Francis, who almost blows up the Mayflower, are at the bottom of the list after William Palmer, who came on the Fortune. William Bradford doesn't like the silver-tongued Billington, who raises a family of independent thinkers. I think I know what started it, right after they got off the Mayflower and before William Bradford became governor. On the second exploration party back in November of 1620, 16 men were scouting for a site to build the town. They were strung out single file on a deer path through the thick woods. When Stephen Hopkins, the pilgrim with Indian experience, was showing them an Indian deer trap in the path. Notice the hole and the spring? William Bradford at the back of the line blusters his way to the front to see what the holdup is and steps right into the trap, which swings him upside down in the tree. I can't help but laugh. John Billington starts laughing hysterically while the future governor is demanding to be released. 10 years later, John Billington's silver tongue cannot save him. Protecting his wilderness property, he wings a known poacher, and when the man dies the same day, Bradford tries Billington for murder. He is convicted and hanged, the first execution in the New World. Today, the Billington descendants have petitioned the Massachusetts government for a pardon in honor of 2020. Don't hold your breath. The governor said no. Now we're working on the senators and the representatives. Baby Samuel Eaton's father, Francis, marries widow Christiana Penn, who came on the Anne, and they have 3 children together, Rachel, Benjamin, and a child with special needs. In 1633, Francis Eaton dies, so Christiana marries Francis Billington. That makes pillow talk easier. And they have 4 children by 1642. Benjamin is now 15, and they apprentice him out to John Winslow, the married Winslow brother, who is now successful. At the end of the term, Benjamin could get 12 bushels of Indian corn and 25 acres of land, like one of the Winslow's other apprentices. At age 6, Joseph Billington is apprenticed with John Cooke and wife Hester, the Walloon, rhymes with balloon. The Billington daughters, Elizabeth, Martha, and Mary, are all apprenticed out when they're young too. Girls are often placed in homes as a mother's little helper. 4 more children are born after 1642, and all the Billington children that grow up also marry. In fact, when Martha, still a spinster at 24, marries her stepbrother, Samuel, and they have 4 children. There's nothing wrong with it. It just sounds icky. In fact, it sounds like some of my first cousins today. While this is called the Richard Warren Company, I think of it as the Elizabeth Walker Warren Company. Richard came on the Mayflower alone. Elizabeth brought their 5 teenage daughters on the Anne. Do you think those girls were popular? She also gives birth to 2 sons in the New World. Richard dies shortly after this cattle division, but Elizabeth steps in for him and is the only woman allowed to sign official documents like a property bill of sale. They have one of the greatest numbers of descendants, including daughter Sarah, who gives us another Mayflower twofer. She marries John Cooke, the son of Francis Cooke, and his wife, Hester the Walloon, right? Remember? Notice who has wormed his way into the company of the family with all the daughters? The son of the silver-tongued merchant, the second-generation fun-loving John Billington Jr. Back in 1620, soon after they are allowed to get off the Mayflower, John Jr. gets lost in the woods and is taken hostage by a warring Indian tribe 20 miles away. The Indians carry him back covered in beads and feathers. The Pilgrim leaders negotiate for his release with the aid of Squanto, their Indian friend and translator. Unfortunately, on one of his trips into the forest, he never comes back. I think he went back with the Indians. What do you think? George Sewell, another of my ancestors, arrives as a helper to Edward Winslow. He and his brother Johannes were born in Holland, as their parents were dissenters long before the Pilgrims. Johannes, also known as John, was the printer for Winslow and Brewster's illegal booklet, Perth Assembly. George, now all grown up, marries and has a large family. But they are the bickering kind. Even later in his will, George forbids son John from fighting with his sister Patience or risk losing his inheritance. Can you imagine that codicil in a will? Pretty unusual. Remember Peter Brown and his mastiff for his 8 sheep? He marries Martha Ford, the only woman who came on the Fortune. On the voyage, she became first a widow and then a new mother. Peter becomes stepfather to her babies, John and Martha, and soon they will have their own baby, Mary. William Bradford becomes governor on and off For 30 years. He reigns longer than many British kings. As Dorothy died on the Mayflower, he sends for and marries Alice Carpenter Southworth, a widow that's a friend, from Leiden. They have 3 children. Plus, they take in many of the young men, including Joseph Rogers and William Latham, plus the Mortons, whose mother Juliana is Alice's sister and who marries Manasseh Kempton. Have you got this all straight? Her first husband, George Morton, died shortly after arriving on the Anne. Even though he died in 1623, George Morton is critical to the success of the Plymouth plantation. Do you know what he did? Remember the Fortune pirate raid? Besides the people, the only thing that survived? Edward Winslow's journal about the first year in Plymouth, including the first Thanksgiving story. While still in Leiden, George published it and sent copies to England. This was the best public relations, which helped bring 1,000 people a year to New England, creating the Great Migration. But why did Plymouth seem to fade away? The Puritans. They just want to purify the Church of England, not separate from it. As a result, they get to keep their jobs and continue making money. So they can afford to bring fleets of ships, starting in 1629, followed shortly by John Winthrop, my ancestor, on the Arabella. Unfortunately, they also bring worries of witchcraft, diverting attention from the separatists. Our first intrepid pioneers, the Mayflower Pilgrims. You now know them not just as salt and pepper shakers, but as real people.